Hello, my name is Joe Park. I'm CEO of Horizon Stewardship, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today, Money and Ministry, 7 Financial Mistakes You Don't Want to Make. This is actually the overview webinar for a series of monthly webinars that we will be putting on with our ministry partners, CapinCrouse, over the course of the year. We'll be delivering them approximately once a month. I'm thrilled to have with me for this overview a very familiar face, Stan Reiff, who's a partner at CapinCrouse, and his contemporary, Ken Tan, also a partner at CapinCrouse. If it works with you, we're going to jump right into the first of the 7 mistakes to avoid. The first is not optimizing your financial operations team. Stan, why don't you unpack this one for us?
Sure, Joe, and thank you again for the opportunity to share. And what we're finding, unfortunately, certainly in churches, maybe more so than any of the other ministries we serve, churches don't always optimize for the greatest talent or professional skill sets, especially behind the scenes in the business office. This has only been heightened with the pandemic and the changes and the additional pressure the churches are feeling. Add to that the great resignation and a lot of transitions. And so that's not necessarily a challenge, it's an opportunity. And what we're finding in our research is there are a lot of people, like Ken and I have already discussed, that have come from a public accounting profession and now are, because of the pandemic, are saying, we want to be more purposeful with our lives. We want to add value. It's not just about a career path. It's not just about making money. It's about making an eternal difference. And we're finding churches and ministries are actually getting opportunities to hire incredibly talented, gifted professionals in their business office, whether it's on the accounting side or HR or otherwise, that they may not have thought about before. And so what that implies is, if you have transitions going on in your church, don't get discouraged. Look at this as an opportunity to potentially even upgrade the talent capabilities of your team.
So Stan, let's make this a little more accessible. Everybody on the webinar may not be familiar with all the different words and options out there. I can tell you from my experience over the last 18 months, we have seen a significant shift in the quality of the accounting services that our local churches are employing, either through hiring someone who's got a CFO kind of mindset, upgrading from a bookkeeper to a controller, using fractional services, outsourcing. So we're seeing a lot of that going on. But let's talk just a little bit about what those roles are. What's the difference between a CFO, a controller, a bookkeeper, in your view?
So yeah, great question, Joe. Thanks for asking that. So for us, a bookkeeper would be like a paraprofessional who's really recording the transactions and entering the information into your general ledger accounting system. Your controller, even by that word, as it says, it's controlling the information and the environment to make sure everything's accurate. And a controller, by definition, is looking backwards in time at all the records that have been kept. So we're going to look at all the transactions from last month. We're going to look at the bank reconciliations for all the deposits and the disbursements that were issued last month and reconcile and issue financial statements based on the prior period. So we're looking and controlling the environment to ensure that fraud opportunities are minimized. And Ken will talk about that a little bit later. A CFO, by definition, is forward thinking. You're anticipating the future. You're doing risk management. You're looking at cash projections, cash flow requirements, and anticipating strategically where you're going as an organization. And as Gretzky, the hockey player, is famously known for, skating to where the puck will be. So I use this analogy regularly, that the controller is in the driver's seat and looking through all the rear view mirrors. The CFO is in the driver's seat looking through the windshield at what's coming. And that's maybe some of the easiest ways to understand the differences. Even though a lot of churches and ministries will use those terms synonymously, they're actually very, very different by skill. Quite frankly, they're different by temperament. And so really understanding what your church needs, and it may be that your church primarily needs the controller and just a little bit of a CFO. And it's hard to find both of those in the same person because different skill set, experiences, and temperaments. So that's where sometimes if you only have money for one position, hiring two part-time, one that's looking backwards and maintaining the environment, one's looking forward at risk management and strategy. Sometimes that becomes a great solution for a church with limited resources or size. Now, the flip side is certainly some churches, depending on each local environment, have been affected differently based on some of the regulations and the ability to open church or whatnot. So with that, some churches are needing different set of talent than they've had, maybe not be able to find the talent they're looking for at a price point they can afford. And so rather than just continue limping along and surviving, a lot of our thriving churches are saying, you know what, we ought to consider outsourcing some or all of our business office aspects. And so that's one of the things we as a firm have stepped in the last few years to do, is really increase our service to our client base by providing outsourced client accounting services, everything from accounts payable to payroll. But we also help with month-end close, fractional CFO, fractional controller, fractional director of finance, so that you really can get the talent pool you're needing at a price point you can afford, and not have to worry about all the recruiting, all the training, all the management of that staff and the technical aspects of it, which then allows you as a church leadership group to focus on your ministry and then get, we would hope, and our expectation is improve services and dashboards and information around how your church is functioning. So that's what we mean by not optimizing your financial operations team, of making sure you've got the best competencies possible for the price points that you can afford. And that's where we're seeing some churches are missing it.
So Stan, you did a great job unpacking that. And that's the real difference that I've seen in churches today, particularly thriving churches, is bringing on that CFO thinking, whether that is on staff or fractionally. And let me go ahead and say that there are a lot of great CPAs out there that understand the church world. And if you've got one, I would encourage you to use them. If they are offering fractional services, then I'd encourage you to see what is available and how that may fit in your church. Because if you are a church of any size, and by that, I mean really a mid-sized to a large church, 500,000 in giving and up, the complexity of the environment we're in has gotten to be so significant that this level of expertise would solve a lot of the calls that we get for churches that are in a challenging position. If you don't have a relationship with one of those, with a local CPA, I'd encourage you to check out CapinCrouse. We have found them to be really among the finest groups that we work with. I'm going to jump right now to the second question. And this one, Ken, if you don't mind, it is assuming your current financial systems can support your growth. And I also wonder about not just supporting your growth, but supporting the liminal space that we're in. There's so much need for information, even if you're not experiencing growth. What are your insights on that?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Again, overall, I think one of the things that has happened, of course, we all know what we have just been through over the last 2 years. The last 2 years have been a period of adjustments and transitions. But for us, I would say as an opportunity has become a period where it has served as a catalyst for many churches to look and see where they currently are at, especially when we start thinking about not just front-facing type operations that the church has. That's the same case for behind the scenes. One of the things we have seen here, especially when we have talked to a lot of our clients and even some of our own network churches that we work alongside with, we have noticed that those that have been able to adapt and assess where they are and adjust as needed have been able to thrive during this time. And that's something that's very important for us to be very mindful of, especially for all of our churches, because we know that over time, honestly, one of the biggest challenges that ends up happening for a church or a nonprofit has been the term of complacency. realizing that status quo, things have been working pretty well. We don't have to fix it. Maybe we can just put a little duct tape on it. But then we realized that the last 2 years have really changed the way we had to approach things. There had been a period of uncertainty where those that we say tactical or strategic in nature really had to work alongside those that had seen where trends were for the churches. And so with that comes also the factor of what types of tools can we use? Now, of course, there's going to be some accounting systems that are fairly well known across the board for churches. But one of the things we need to try and ask is, taking an inventory, where are we currently at? Is the system that we're using, is it able to answer the questions we need, as well as also the questions that are probably going to come up, the what ifs, the whys? And so one of the things we also have to think about is not just the tools of just the basic debits and credits or financial reporting, but even what are some of the dashboards that can give us an idea. It's very important for whether it's the CFO or even as the lead pastor and many of those in leadership to be equipped with this type of data. It's something that's very interesting and very exciting to see that a lot of our churches now, especially during this time of growth, are trying to assess this. One of the things I had talked about in some of my other previous presentations, talked about, some of the basics of ratios, but even using that as a way to help equip your church. We want to have it where the tools behind us, whether the controller, the director of finance, the accounting team, that they're able to have an accounting system that can grow with it. One of the things you have to ask too is, what is the current state of our church in terms of other factors of operations? Is there a school involved? What are some of the reporting requirements for our schools that we need to make sure we can answer? When we start going through this, the biggest thing we talk about is due diligence, because part of this is we know that for any accounting system, change is a fairly large type of process that can be very costly in terms of overall finances and as well as time. We want to make sure that when it comes to the accounting systems that are being used, that one, it really does allow us to have some peace of mind and confidence, knowing that what is going to come out of it will really outweigh any of the potential costs that are coming as a part of that. When I think about even just like you were saying there, Joe, about dashboards, or even just thinking about future facing, that is really becoming very important for us now, especially because over the past couple of years, what we started seeing there's been a shift, not just in demographics, but even just the trends that come with that. We start talking about what are things that are going to impact us over the next 10 years. There's a lot of things, not just generational, but even financial. How is it for us that we're going to be able to see and pinpoint what are certain things for us that we can identify to help us navigate through that? And so really one of the things that I just want to encourage folks here is that it's never too late to take a look at where we currently are at. I know most likely, if things are working well, you probably don't ask those questions. But hey, I think it's always great, especially now we're entering, of course, the new year in 2022, that it's still early for us prior to budgets and everything, just to say, hey, what are some pain points that we have as a team? What are some of the questions that some of our missions leader and leadership are having that we can help answer? We really want to make sure that as a part of that, we're factoring that as continuing development for our churches and our nonprofits to be able to factor and identify as well. So
let me just give a couple of really practical checklist kind of items. If you've been on the same financial system, accounting system for 5 years or longer, you need to pause and reassess. We're not saying change, we're saying reassess. At a minimum, you might need to reset the toggles, you might need to reset your chart of accounts, or you may find you need to change your system. That's just a little bit of what we're going to talk about in further detail later, but I wanted to just share there's some very, very practical checklists and things you need to think about to ensure that you're moving forward, because without those systems, we can't handle the budget appropriately.
I can't wait to get to the webinar where we focus on that entirely, working on the generosity side. One of our great frustrations is the inability to get the information that we need, that the church needs to set up its dashboards. And I'm really looking on the donor side. So if they don't have those there, I'm looking at the reports that the finance team gets, and it is discouraging because it's all backward looking, or tends to be backward looking, and that finance team really needs to be looking forward, which takes us into really our next point, and that is managing budgets like nothing has changed. Stan, this is a huge issue that that we see, that churches will budget and then they'll move along and make no adjustments to it. And so by the time we get to the end of the year, it doesn't resemble any sort of a meaningful document. It seems as if it was just a box that needed checking at the beginning. What should churches be doing?
One thing we've learned in the last 2 years is change is the only thing that's constant. Everything's changing all the time, and nothing's going to be the same like it used to be. And so there, we have new normals, and that new normal is constant change. That affects our budget, and unfortunately, the way we've budgeted for decades is no longer a viable, appropriate, or even relevant method where those who are vision casting do one thing, and then the business office does a budget, and never should the two ever meet. Well, that just doesn't work anymore. We're saying you've got to start with your strategy and then overlay the budget with it in a meaningful way of what you're trying to accomplish. The other thing is, because there's so much change, you certainly want to have an annual budget that's based on real numbers of fixed costs as well as projected revenue based on realistic revenue numbers. And again, in the next webinar, we'll talk about that in more detail, how to really forecast in a practical way in a season of uncertainty. So you want to still have that North Star of where you're going for the year, but we're strongly advocating to really break it down in more of a 90-day detailed side. So as changes are occurring, you've got that 90 days, we know we can do this for the next 90 days, and we'll reassess and then make sure that the next 90 days we're still spot on, or if things have changed. I use the analogy, we're all familiar with the Pareto principle, the 80-20. Well, 80% of our budget should really be linked to what we know God's called us to, that are kind of the table stakes. But in our world of change, we should be thinking about having 20% of our margin set aside for unknown, the unexpected, when God shows up, gives us a ministry opportunity we weren't expecting otherwise. Otherwise, we're so committed to something that may or may not be effective, that may or may not be efficient, we don't have the resources to follow God in obedience for a more meaningful, more relevant community outreach. And so with that, we look at our staffing, what do we need? And so again, we've talked about this before, Joe, but as we went from in-person to online, and now we're hybrid, and you can't stop one or the other, you kind of have to do both, and yet you also have to have additional resources for new opportunities, or as the congregation's requirements or demands shift, you need to be able to respond and say, you know what, we've got plenty of staffing in this category, but we need staffing in this set of skill sets. And so you need to redeploy those, and maybe somebody already has those skill sets, you just reassign them, or sometimes you have to attract new talent. And so I've actually worked with some organizations that halfway through the year, because they had enough change in their ministry strategy and their impact in the local community, we actually had to hit reset and have a whole new budget, because to continue to operate on the budget we adopted for the year was totally irrelevant and meaningless. And so to be bold and courageous, say, you know what, that budget we drafted a year ago and we're 6 months into it just doesn't make sense anymore. Let's create a new one for the remaining 6 months that is appropriate, is really the way to think about it these days. So not being so married as a CPA, as a CFO, as a controller to what was in place, but having some flexibility to recognize that God has showed up, something's different, and our church is behaving differently with a different responsibility and a different ministry outreach to impact our community. We need to be responsive to that.
Stan, before we get too far down that pathway, what I'm understanding you saying, and for those of you that don't know, prior to being called into ministry, I was a bank CEO, have an MBA, so I totally geek out on all of this stuff. But what you're really describing is in 90-day budgets is beginning with a budget and making adjustments. If you're not doing that, you may find yourself where you have to actually completely restart a budget. And there will be things that happen over the course of the year that would cause you to completely revamp a budget. We can talk about that more in the next one. But for churches, that approving the budget is part of your polity. What you're able to do is, when you're approving the budget, is to go ahead with that motion and say, in every 90 days, we will update this to reflect our realities. Unless you are in a really congregational kind of setting, you usually don't have to go back and reapprove those minor adjustments unless it's making a significant shift in the total giving. So if you get that language in, you won't have the pushback later on with, oh no, we have to take this to the church for approval, because you've got that approval right at the beginning. Stan, you also mentioned, you called it hybrid. I like to call it multi-access, because hybrid makes it sound like it's something in between, like in the days of music where we had traditional and we had contemporary, and then we tried to do a blended service, and found that that didn't really have sustaining power over time. Multi-access begins to normalize the fact that people are going to worship, do spiritual formation on campus, online, and also on demand. There are really three channels we're working with there, which gets me back to a question I'm passionate about. I'm guessing you all are as well, and that is about the metric shift.
Great question, Joe. I would suggest that, by the way, and I love your multi-access versus hybrid, so I may adopt that and give you credit at least 3 times. After that, I'll call it mine, if that's okay.
Yeah, that came from a group of millennials that were studying online spiritual formation, how to do it, and they were the ones that created that word, and I've been trying to get it out there, but it wasn't me who created it.
So yeah, it's what we're seeing, and you're absolutely correct. For years, the primary church metrics, and we'll go into this deeper in a future webinar, Joe, but just again, maybe more as a teaser than anything else. Attendance and annual budget, and breaking it down on a weekly basis, 1 through 52 Sundays, have been traditional for weeks or for years and maybe decades. But in recent, because there's multi-access now, we've unfortunately made some bad assumptions in a lot of churches, where if you're not present, you're not one of the committed. And so data, and again, that's where having the right donor management system, church management system, and general accounting system that will give you much better data. Here's what we're finding is sometimes the most engaged, and we're suggesting engagement becomes the key metric. And then it can be defined different ways, and it is measurable, but you've got to be a little bit more creative and design your systems to capture it. Here's what we're discovering early right now. The most engaged may not be the ones attending Sunday morning service, which blows people away. But when we study the demographics of those, many times they are serving Sunday mornings, or they're not in the seat in the worship center. They are giving consistently, either through ACH, EFT, credit card, text to give, but it's a reoccurring gift. And what they do is then they go home and watch church at home online. But they're the most active givers, and they're the ones serving the most, and maybe leading a small group. So they check more boxes of engagement. They're just not sitting there Sunday morning for a variety of reasons.
Now I want to start the wave here, because you really hit on a point that I look forward to developing. So if we're dropping teasers, I can tell you that engagement is the greatest corollary to giving. We had one of our large church clients do a data study and used a data scientist to do it. And we have realized this in our own one-on-one church in our own one-on-one church studies, but people who attend 1 to 2 times a month are only giving you about 1% of their income. But if you can get them in a community group where they're active, you can get them serving, they're going to give you about 3.5 times that amount of money. So this is why at Horizons, we say that discipleship is really the process by which you will change the culture. You can fundraise, but when you disciple people, you are changing the culture of generosity. And one last teaser: very few churches' budgets are set up for that. If the greatest return is on small groups, Sunday school classes, and in serving, why do we spend 60% of our budget on worship and starve those areas that actually help to grow the disciple, who then funds the ministry? So I look forward to that. Watching our time, I want to jump on, Ken, and bring you to the next place, and that is ignoring vulnerabilities that lead to fraud. This is this is such a huge area where churches are just blind because they've not ever had anybody come in and help them assess their blind spots. They put in practices that were effective 5 or 10 years ago. They're still doing those things today, but the realities and the risk have changed. What are you recommending for churches?
Yeah, no, I think it's always interesting just so whenever we think of the concept of fraud, that, especially when I have my presentations, I always mention that for many churches, when we think about fraud, it is always interesting to examine, especially when it comes to when things pop up like that, but it is far from interesting to be experiencing it. And so it's always just a note here, whenever we think about fraud, especially for the church and the whole foundation and the perception of the church, a lot of what happens is based on the principles of trust. And we think about fraud at the very end of the day is a violation of trust. And so when we think about that, the damage that ends up happening to churches, there have been so many calls where, especially when I've had to talk to some folks when something like this came up, one of the first things that usually comes out of their mind outside of just being surprised is, I never would have guessed this would have happened here. When we think about even just from overall statistics, when we think about, for me as a certified fraud examiner, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners came out every year with a study that surveys when it comes to instances of fraud. And unfortunately, fraud is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the world. When we think about it specifically for the church, only about 3% of all fraud cases relate to religious organizations. When we think about just dollar value, the average median loss is $75,000, which is a very substantial amount of money for a church. We think about what that could have been used for missions, for different ministries to help onboard new team members that could help. That in itself is a major impact. We even factor in just the fact that over half of the losses are never going to be recovered. So that in itself is detrimental. And one of the things I'm sure for you, Joe, what you guys have seen is it's not just a financial impact when we think about when a church is a victim of fraud, but even non-financial. One of the things that ends up happening is many times when a church does encounter an instance of fraud at their church, usually the goal is to try and mediate it internally, because they know that the moment that it ends up on the news, because when you think about news, you're usually, if you're a church, there's usually 2 reasons why you're on there: for something that really good happened, or oftentimes something that really bad happened. And if it's something about fraud, think about the perception of a new member or a person that is just attending, seeing that and just saying, okay, so if there was not accountability in the finances, how am I going to have that confidence that you guys are having accountability throughout? And one of the things when we start thinking about just overall the concept of internal controls, many times part of this ends up being a part of the growth itself, is that because a lot of what has been done has been just more so just as a necessity of, okay, we've had one person handling our books. Even though we're growing, since our budgets are so tight, we can't bring in another person. I guess for now, we'll just keep it as is. Segregation of duties is very, very important. keeping the people separate from those who are authorizing, from those having custody, as well as those recording. We'll talk more about that in another session, but really one of the things that I really want to encourage those that are on here is to really look back and just say, where are we currently? You know, when we start saying, take an inventory of not just our team members or accounting systems, also looking at our processes. If we can't afford to have another full-time person, what can we do? You know, we've ended up having where a lot of our clients that have come and joined us end up asking about our ability to serve that, to have those levels of review. When we think about specifically for fraud and even just the overall parts of internal controls, many times churches will say, well, you know, we have an audit, an external audit, which is just as good in terms of importance, but really external audits aren't meant to identify fraud. Most of the responsibility really has to be with management, with leadership, the overall tone at the top, and making sure, similar to one of the things that President Reagan has said before, trust but verify. For us, you know, just think about by human nature, when there is an opportunity and we're able to justify an action on that, that temptation grows bigger and bigger. And if we don't get caught, that continues to grow into saying, I can probably do it more. And unfortunately, what ends up happening there is if there isn't that ability to hold people accountable, that will continue to grow and the damage would be beyond financial. So one of the things, again, I just want to encourage is that for each of the people here, for them to go back with leadership, talk through it and say, okay, where are we currently? Who all is handling what? When was the last time we actually looked at this? We know that the last 2 years have been a little bit unique in terms of suddenly many of us that probably were working in person together had to shift to a remote capacity. How are we addressing that? How are we making sure that there's safeguarding and that there's proper levels of control? We really want to make sure that's on their thoughts. Yes, go ahead.
Ken, you're asking the local churches to do that, and that's great. If you've got people who are CPAs, they're professionals, they already do internal control examinations and are willing to get in and follow, you know, we've got so many more checks coming in the mail. What are we doing to protect the mail? That's just it became a huge issue during COVID. If churches don't have that skill set to make that examination themselves, I know you all have a product that is very inexpensive, at least from my perspective, for the peace of mind of knowing that somebody who is come in from the outside and looked at us, because we don't always see things. We can be blind to what's happening. Sort of, you know, the guest that walks into the new space, they see the water leak, they see the worn carpet, but we walk right through there on a Sunday morning and miss it altogether. So what can CapinCrouse do to help in this area?
No, great question, Joe. And one of the things, I appreciate you bringing that up. So one of the things that our firm offers is what we call the church checkups or church assessments. And within it, there's different modules actually. So church, especially when you start thinking about budget, they don't have to do all the modules, but one of the modules that is on there is internal controls. I say one of the things that's important for a church is to be able to have someone there who has had a fresh set of eyes to be able to see where things are. Also be able to come in with a level of experience from other churches and see what are some best practices for a similar size organization, similar size positions in terms of teams. What are being done there that can be available to be implemented in that area? I would say with our church checkups and church assessments, many times, you know, this has been a service that we have provided because there's often not, churches don't need an audit unless there's some type of loan covenant or some type of local requirement by their states, or especially when it comes to accreditation. When it comes to that, then many times, since churches don't get audits, more often than not, they don't interact with a CPA firm unless there's some specific situation that comes up. We found this is to be a very useful tool and a very useful resource because we know that churches, they really want to make sure that what they're doing is in line with being up to date with not just the most recent guidance, but just most recent and best practices that other churches are having. And I think for us, what's a blessing about our ability is that, you know, for myself and Stan, even though we worked with numerous churches, thankfully, since our firm is so national in reach, there's other partners or other colleagues who have interacted with similar situations that probably we could also factor when it comes to interacting with our church clients itself. So that's hopefully a little bit of about church checkups in a nutshell, of course. But
So a couple of more teasers. When we get into the webinar on this, we're going to talk about how to communicate the safety and soundness practices that you have, internal controls that you have, because they really do matter to your donor. Research tells us that it's the third or the fourth most important factor in where someone chooses to give. But one quick teaser, Ken. Apart from the obvious dual control around writing checks and counting money, what is one of the biggest blind spots that you see churches missing and leaving themselves exposed?
Honestly, I think it's the perception that, especially when it comes to trust, we think about it many times, and honestly, this is coming from real life cases and examples where there may be some internal controls in place, but because the overall mindset, the culture has been a level of trust and not asking questions, you may have controls in place, but whether or not they're effective is a different question, right? It's a different type of approach that needs to be done. Because let's say, for example, you have those levels of reviews, but let's say the perception is a person in senior leadership wants to get a check, and you may not want to ask the question as to why, and you just proceed to do that. That in itself overrides the control. We start seeing that, especially when it came to some of the situations there. Many times the perception of being able to say, okay, we're going to entrust that this person, they really needed this was an exception, we're going to proceed. Honestly, that's one way that people, in terms of perpetrators, have identified weaknesses in internal controls. And so again, I just say that one of the biggest things in terms of that is having that mindset. It's not meant to say we want you to be judgmental or overall skeptical of people, but to have that level, when we think about the Christian mindset, of being accountable for one another, being able to assure each other that, hey, this isn't meant because I don't trust you, but this is a way that for you and I, we can share that burden together. Because anytime a person has to handle all this, whether they're doing it all correctly, that is a big burden, because at the end of the day, all the questions will go back to that person. We really want it to be that when you have people there able to have this level of review, as well as the perception that, hey, I'm here to help hold each other accountable, that provides way more relief than anything else. So.
Thanks, Ken.
Mm-hmm.
Stan, let's turn the page here. Not understanding your giving data and risk. Unpack that for us.
Yeah, Joe, you've heard me say this before. So many churches and their senior leaders or their clergy have this aversion to really knowing or understanding the giving capacity in their church. They don't want the right hand to know what the left hand's doing. They don't want to treat somebody differently, out of some of Paul's writings. But the reality is, I think we need to look at it differently. Just like we would never put anybody up on stage who can't sing, we know their spiritual gift of being musical. We don't put somebody up to teach a Sunday school class or a small group if they don't have the gift of teaching. Those who have the gift of giving need to be discipled also. And if they have the gift of giving, they probably have the gift of making it to be able to give it. And they need a very unique discipleship as well. So understanding that and bringing them in to the, because many times they're going to be business leaders, either corporate executives or business owners, let them be a part of some of the church structure, meaning the strategic planning and understanding the business processes, and tap into that skill set that many churches are missing. And that's part of this whole donor engagement. And beyond that, understanding the different giving levels and what's happening and the behaviors, understanding the frequency of the giving. Joe, you can probably speak to this better than I can. We'll maybe need to say this for a future webinar, but giving patterns are really important. The frequency, and if they stop, generally speaking, the last stats I was reading was they stop giving about 6 months before they leave. I say the wallet leaves the church 6 months before the person does. So that that ratio may have changed some, but you need to understand, why did they quit giving? Sometimes it's because there was a loss of a job and they're going to relocate. Sometimes it's a health challenge, a crisis. They're having medical bills, they use some assistance. And sometimes there's just a disagreement that if you were to solve and understand, you could keep. And so a lot of times when people quit giving, they're checking to see, does the church notice? Do they care? And will they come talk to me about what's going on in my life? So these are not a way to just get more money from somebody. It's a discipleship understanding that many times we don't look at the data to help inform us on how to better disciple those that God's entrusted to our congregations.
I would also say that it's a pastoral care issue too, especially when somebody quits giving. We help churches set up Horizons Analytics. We've got donor analytics software that will sit on top of your church CHMS to get you data that comes out. We vet third parties and represent and train third party vendors in that. And one of the things that we will always recommend is that you measure the frequency. And when that frequency changes, not just it's been 45 days, but when that frequency changes, that is an indicator that something has changed with that household to the good or the bad, and it needs a reaction. If it is to the negative, what it needs is a pastoral care call, as opposed to someone from the finance office dunning them. And so there's a software out there that allows for those triggers to be set up. In fact, two that allow for those triggers to be set up and actually create a list of names of folks that have deviated from their pattern that may need pastoral concern or a thank you letter from the clergy. So those are some of the things we'll unpack in the webinar. And the other, just in closing on this subject, is giving units. When we use the term giving unit, we're thinking about those donors that give $200 or more per year. And we call that a giving unit. Below that, they're a donor, yes, but in the typical church, and this is based on nationwide data, half of your donors give you less than $200 in annual giving, and they contribute between 1% and no more than 5%. I think that's the highest I've seen in any church of your total giving. So when you're beginning to run ratios and your denominator is based on giving units, you get much more accurate data than if it's based on donors, because half of your donors are giving you less than $200 and typically about 1% of your income. And so how you measure that becomes incredibly important. That's going to be a very fun webinar. We've got a lot to say on that. So Ken, I'm coming back. Go ahead.
Joe, let me just add one more comment as we transition to the next item. The other thing I think is critical with what you just said is these 7 money mistakes are not in isolation.
Right.
These are all interrelated. So we can take what we just talked about, understanding the donor, and you're talking about donor software and giving unit software where you can do this analysis. That goes back to question number 1 and question number 2, or mistake number 2. Are your systems in place? Do you have the right people doing the right things and thinking about it? And is your software, is it current? Is it adequate? Do you have the software that is available? Is it linked in properly so you can get this data that's readily available so you don't make multiple mistakes at the same time?
Absolutely agreed. Ken, I'm going to ask you to do this one quickly because
Sure.
We're running short on time. Number 6, not reviewing current commitments or adequately preparing for new lending opportunities.
Yeah, I'll try to be as quick as possible. And building on to what Stan said, you can just see how this all interrelates. When you think about a church, when they're experiencing a period of growth, when they have the ability to look at their organization, the folks that are in there, how important financial metrics and dashboards are. One of the things that's also important is, as a part of this growth, sometimes comes a conversation on how are we going to finance that? What are our current commitments? And I think for you as a former banker, this really is important. What is our financial health? So that whenever we do go to a bank, what are the things they're going to look at and ask for? Because especially when we start thinking about it, there have been many churches that we've interacted with where they already have a number of financial commitments, especially when it comes to loans from a previous capital project. And we know that for some of these other growth projects that are happening, that it's getting fairly large in terms of how much loans are needed or financial commitments are needed. And so what I want to try and say and encourage in this is, as a church, when you think about your lending readiness, think of it about the same way you build your own personal credit score, right? You want to have it as healthy as possible. So when you go to present it, you can show that, hey, from a risk perspective, we are very healthy. We have enough in terms of financials from a cash perspective. We're not heavily leveraged, that from a risk perspective that, we would not be able to meet our commitments. That way for the bank, they'd be able to see this and say, okay, this is someone that we really do want to proceed with and commit with. This is where, of course, Those metrics are very important. Some of the things we're talking about with giving units, what is the steady, what are the trends that we're saying, are we going to be able to meet any commitments we're about to enter into, as well as those we currently have? We really want to make sure that from our approach, we're going back to stewardship. Are we going to make sure that what we currently are committed to is going to be in line with what we have planned for over the next couple of years? And as well as anything else coming in, how are we going to make sure that we properly navigate that? How are we going to present ourselves so that, of course, from the accurate perspective, we are financially healthy? If we aren't, what are we going to do to take steps to really approach that and allow us to get to that point that we need to be?
So could you just quickly unpack the difference between reviews and audits?
Sure. When we think about reviews, ultimately they all come under what we call the attest umbrella, in which there are different levels in terms of the level of detail that's being done. When we think about reviews, it is more analytical in nature. So they're going to be looking at a high level where things are from the financial perspective. When we start getting into an audit, it's a little bit more in-depth. There's walkthroughs, there's tested details, tested controls. There's a level in terms of how much time is spent that would ultimately require a higher level in terms of the opinion and the overall exposure for the auditor in terms of their ability to provide an opinion on the financials. That in itself, even just from a difference perspective, there is a difference in cost as well, in which reviews are typically a lot more cost efficient compared to audits, because audits do require a lot more time. There's a lot more risk involved that in terms of, for the auditor, will require them to do more procedures. And so when we start thinking about the difference between both, reviews are a little more high level, audits are a little more in-depth. And that would also show in the financial reports when you get it. You will also see whether or not it has been audited or has been reviewed as well, specifically within the letter as well. So,
Ken, we'll go into that more deeply in the webinar when we do that. But I see a lot of churches that have priced an audit and don't realize that a review is something much more cost effective that would at least give them some level of confidence in the financial statements that they're putting out. So Stan, last one, we've touched on this in a lot of different ways. We could do a series of webinars on this, but not planning and budgeting for the multi-access model. This is huge. We already talked about if we know that engagement is a key measure, if we know that discipleship is where the greatest financial return on investment and spiritual return on investment is, and yet we're budgeting to assuming everybody's walking in the front door and worship is that, and yet what we also know is most people visit 2 or 3 times online or on demand before they walk in the door. Most church budgets that I see don't take that into consideration. They're thinking old model. Add some more to that, Stan.
Yeah, just as a teaser, Joe, and you're right, we've already talked about it briefly, and there's a lot more we can unpack, but again, a little bit of a chuckle here, Joe. If you go back to our PPP days, a year or 2 ago, where we talked about churches were saving their money on coffee, donuts, and toilet paper, and were able to use it to go online because nobody was in the buildings in person. Well, now that we're back in person and online, and this multi-access environment, really understanding that there are new costs that we can't cut, we can't shift. They're now both required. But add to that, during this time frame, a lot of churches have actually expanded to additional local ministry outreach that they may not want to give up, whether it's to certain demographic groups that are underserved, impoverished food ministries, homeless shelters, et cetera, that they were diverting some of the funds immediately in the crises, but those needs are still there. And so again, it comes back to the strategy of what are we trying to do as a church? And all these factors, sometimes we might need to say no to a few things to be able to say yes to the great ones. And so that includes the multi-access opportunities, the new community opportunities that we've not had prior to COVID. And so, that's, again, just a little bit of a teaser for the things we need to think about. And if maybe we haven't started yet because we didn't have the money, we may want to think about, is that a much better use of our funds moving forward? It's not too late.
And when we do this webinar, we're going to spend a lot of time with how to build alignment with your key stakeholders. This is just not something a finance team can impose. It is a whole shift in mindset. It takes time to bring that about. And so we're going to be investing in telling you some of the best practices to bring about these necessary cultural changes, not just in this area, but in some of the other areas that we've talked about all the way through, because we recognize if you're the finance team leader, the XP, the CFO, the layperson in charge of finances, you may be bought in, but how do you gather the support you need to really make this work? So we're going to be investing in that.
Really excited about our new resource coming out from CapinCrouse, the Church Financial Field Guide for CFOs. You can go to this link and sign up to receive this free ebook, and it'll have a lot of great information, a lot of additional links, additional resources.
Well, thank you very much, Stan and Ken, for being a part of our webinar today. I look forward to the series that are upcoming, and everybody who participated today, thank you for being a part.